Hello everyone. Life Stories is back. Life Stories wishes you a day full of energy. Today's story is about a very humble old man, but behind him lies an enormous fortune that no one could have imagined. Now, let's dive into the story. Imagine a quiet afternoon when Edward Grant, a humble and reserved old man, walks through the doors of a luxurious car dealership. The bright lights, gleaming cars, and employees dressed in expensive suits add an air of sophistication to the scene. But to Edward, all he receives are cold stares and blatant disregard. No one pays attention to the man in a worn-out coat and shoes that have weathered the years. Little did they know, the man they looked down upon today would return the very next day, not as a customer, but as their new owner. What followed was a stunning turn of events. Those who once mocked and belittled him were now left bewildered and panicked as Edward took the reins of the business. This story is not just about revenge. It's a profound lesson in patience and dealing with injustice. You won't believe how Edward used his calm demeanor and quiet strength to turn humiliation into an inspiring triumph. It's a journey full of surprises that leaves everyone reflecting. Edward Grant was a man whose outward appearance could easily be overlooked. But inside, he harbored a quiet strength and profound wisdom. For decades, Edward had been silently building an enormous fortune through smart investments and strategic business decisions. However, what truly set him apart was the way he chose to live his life. Despite owning one of the largest fortunes in the state, Edward never flaunted his wealth. He didn't live in extravagant mansions or drive flashy cars. Instead, Edward preferred to keep things simple. He drove an old but reliable car, lived in a modest home, and spent quiet evenings with a cup of tea, reading books, or reflecting on life. This humility wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was an intrinsic part of who Edward was. To him, wealth wasn't about what you show off, but how you use it to create change. He lived quietly yet powerfully, and only those who truly paid attention would realize that Edward was an extraordinary man, with a sharp intellect and an unwavering heart. But sometimes, Edward's humility and simplicity made him an easy target for others to underestimate. It was during one such instance, at a car dealership, that Edward was belittled and humiliated by those who judged solely by appearances. However, they had no idea that their misjudgment would mark the beginning of a profound transformation, not just for Edward, but also for those who had once looked down on him. On a chilly afternoon, Edward decided to stop by a car dealership in town. The car he had been driving, while still reliable, had been with him for nearly a decade. Though not one for ostentation, Edward felt it was time for an upgrade. He had his eye on one of the luxury models that had been heavily advertised, not to show off, but because he valued quality and durability. With an old coat draped casually over his shoulders and well-worn shoes on his feet, Edward walked into the dealership with a relaxed demeanor. He hoped to find a car that suited him, but little did he anticipate that this afternoon would not just be about purchasing a vehicle. It would mark the beginning of a series of events that would leave the entire dealership in shock. Edward Grant, with his usual unassuming demeanor, always knew how to appreciate subtlety and quality. As he stepped into the car dealership, wearing his old coat and worn-out shoes, he embodied the simplicity that defined him. Yet, what greeted him was a cold indifference. The dealership buzzed with activity. Sharply dressed employees in sleek suits were busy attending to young, glamorous customers. The roar of engines from test drives and the lively chatter added to the vibrant atmosphere. Amid this scene, Edward quietly walked in, unnoticed, hoping to find someone willing to assist him. He walked past each car, his eyes lingering on the sleek lines and gleaming surfaces of the vehicles he had seen in advertisements. These weren't just cars, they were symbols of quality and innovation, values he deeply admired. Yet, time passed. After 20 minutes, not a single employee approached him to inquire or offer assistance. Edward remained patient, but a growing sense of disappointment crept in as he realized that, to them, he was just an unremarkable old man, not worth their time. The sting of being underestimated for his simple appearance began to stir within him. But this was merely the beginning of a story that no one at the dealership could have foreseen. After 20 minutes of wandering through the showroom, Edward Grant realized that not a single employee had approached him. It wasn't because they hadn't seen him, but because they had chosen to ignore him. A few glances flickered in his direction, but they carried no warmth or welcome, only disdain, as if he didn't belong there. The employees continued to lavish attention on the young, glamorous, and seemingly wealthy customers, those they believed were more likely to make a purchase. A young salesman with slicked-back hair briefly glanced at Edward but immediately turned away, directing his focus to a well-dressed couple who had just walked in. These were the clients he deemed worthy of his time and effort. Edward maintained his initial patience. He didn't want to bother anyone, quietly standing by the luxury car that had prompted his visit. Gently, he ran his hand over the sleek, polished surface, appreciating the quality he so valued. Yet, the indifference of the staff and the cold atmosphere around him began to stir an uneasy feeling within. They couldn't see the person he truly was, only a simple appearance they were quick to underestimate. He could hear whispers from a distance among the staff, not words of curiosity or interest, but conversations laced with disdain. Their cold gazes and blatant contempt for his presence were like tiny daggers cutting into Edward's sense of dignity. It wasn't just the lack of service that unsettled him. It was their shallow judgment of him based solely on his appearance that truly hurt. To them, he was just an old man who didn't belong there, someone unworthy of stepping into this space. Each passing minute felt like a test of Edward's patience. The silence and disregard from the staff were like an unspoken slap, one that he could no longer tolerate. Finally, he decided to act. With slow yet resolute steps, Edward made his way to the reception desk, where three salespeople were huddled together, chatting. Their smug smiles and casual indifference stood in stark contrast to the admirable calm and determination in Edward's gaze. He knew that this moment would change everything. "Excuse me," Edward Grant said in a calm and polite tone as he reached the reception desk. "I'd like to purchase one of your cars. Could someone assist me?" The man behind the desk barely looked up, casting a cursory glance at Edward. "We're a bit busy right now," he replied, his tone cold and tinged with condescension. "Why don't you come back later?" Edward stood still for a moment. His expression remained unchanged, exuding the same admirable composure. But inside, a shift had begun. He nodded gently, without argument or resistance. Turning to leave the dealership, Edward felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. A profound disappointment mingled with a simmering sense of anger. As he walked out the door, Edward caught a glimpse of one of the salesmen smirking, muttering something that he clearly heard. "What a waste of time with old guys like that." That comment was the final straw. Edward didn't turn back, nor did he display any outward anger. But in the silence, he made a decision that no one at the dealership could have foreseen. They had just gravely underestimated the man they were dismissing. And this would change everything. The mocking laughter and the muttered remark about just window shoppers cut deeply into Edward Grant's pride. Yet what the employees failed to realize was that Edward wasn't the kind of person to be easily dismissed or quietly accept being underestimated. The humiliation he experienced that day didn't just disappoint him. It ignited a fire of determination within him. As he drove his old car home, Edward held onto a silent resolve. This wasn't over. He couldn't allow people who judged others solely by appearances to continue behaving that way. That night, he made a series of critical phone calls, tapping into the powerful business connections he had cultivated over the years. Within hours, Edward had the leverage and resources to execute a plan that no one at the dealership could have anticipated. The next morning, Edward returned to the car dealership, but this time, he didn't walk in as a customer. No longer the man they ignored the day before. Edward arrived as the new owner of the establishment. The employees who had mocked him would soon realize they had made an irreparable mistake. Edward Grant no longer had any interest in buying a car. After what happened the day before, he had set his sights on a much larger goal, owning the entire operation of this car dealership. That morning, as he stepped out of his old car and walked into the showroom, he noticed the same employees who had ignored him were still there. But what stood out most was that they still had no idea who he truly was. David, The dealership's general manager, a middle-aged man with a smug demeanor, hurried over to greet Edward. This time, instead of indifference, David offered a forced smile. "Good morning, sir. How can we assist you today?" he asked, his tone exuding politeness, but unaware that he was standing face to face with a reality that would completely turn the tables. Edward maintained his calm expression, showing no hint of emotion. Slowly, he handed David a stack of documents. "I'm not here to buy a car," Edward said, his gaze piercing through the smugness of the man before him. David took the papers, initially with a casual demeanor, but as he skimmed through their contents, his face turned pale, his hands began to tremble, and the forced smile vanished. The documents in his hands were undeniable proof. Edward Grant had purchased the entire dealership overnight. The atmosphere in the showroom shifted dramatically as the other employees began to realize what was happening. Edward, the man they had mocked and ignored the day before, now stood before them as the new owner of the entire dealership. A murmur spread through the showroom as the staff began to realize what was happening. The smug salespeople who had laughed at and ignored Edward the day before now looked confused and uneasy. A heavy tension filled the air, and every eye was fixed on the man they had once underestimated. Edward remained calm, but his voice carried an authority that commanded silence. He spoke, his words ringing clearly through the room. "I came here yesterday with the hope of purchasing a car." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces that were now losing their confidence. "But instead of receiving assistance, I was ignored, judged, and disrespected simply because of my appearance." Edward continued, his voice steady but weighted with meaning. The room fell utterly silent, the staff seemingly holding their breath, awaiting the next words from the man they had so wrongly dismissed. Edward continued, his voice low and steady yet brimming with authority. "I came here hoping to be treated with respect. Instead, I was ignored, disrespected, and judged solely based on my appearance. Every one of you made assumptions about me without knowing who I am or what I am capable of." His words plunged the room into a heavy silence. The employees exchanged anxious glances. The confident, smug smiles they had worn the day before had completely vanished. None of them had imagined that the man they had dismissed so easily would now stand before them as the one in control. Edward paused, slowly scanning the room before he spoke again. "As of today, I am the owner of this dealership, and everything will change, starting with the people who work here." He turned to David, the general manager, who was now visibly sweating, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. Edward looked directly at him, his sharp gaze showing no trace of pity. "David, you're fired," he said firmly, "and anyone else who has treated me, or any customer, with disrespect will also be let go." The room fell into a stunned silence. The sales staff, those who had laughed at and ignored Edward, now stood frozen, holding their breath. Edward's power didn't stem from anger, but from his calm yet unshakable demeanor. Every word he spoke made it clear that this wasn't just a lesson. It was the beginning of a profound transformation. "The same level of disrespect will no longer have a place here," Edward declared, his voice resolute, as though issuing an unchallengeable decree. And Edward had no intention of wasting time in implementing the necessary changes. He began calling out the names of employees he had carefully observed the previous day. Those who had contributed to the toxic culture of the dealership, the ones who mocked, ignored, or belittled him, were each dismissed in turn. No one could offer an excuse or plea for mercy. Edward had remembered every detail, and today was the day he purged the dealership to restore fairness and respect to this establishment. However, not everyone had to leave. Those who had shown kindness, employees who, regardless of the circumstances, treated customers with courtesy and fairness, were recognized by Edward and given new opportunities. Not only were they retained, but some were also promoted to leadership positions, becoming pioneers for the positive change Edward sought to establish. By the end of the day, nearly half of the old staff had departed, replaced by a new environment where kindness and respect were non-negotiable values. The dealership, once rife with arrogance and discrimination, began its transformation into a place where every customer was treated with fairness and dignity. Edward didn't just overhaul a car dealership, he left behind a profound lesson on the power of humility and compassion. As Edward stepped out of the dealership, now completely under his control, he didn't seek praise or attention. The only thing he felt was a sense of justice, not one he demanded, but one he built himself through calm resolve and determination. Edward hadn't just changed a car dealership, he had reshaped how people perceived the true value of humility, patience, and mutual respect. Edward Grant was no ordinary man, and this story showed the world why. This wasn't merely a tale of humiliation. It was a journey of resilience and an unexpected act of retribution. It highlighted the power of composure and an unassuming appearance, qualities that made it easy for others to underestimate Edward. But in the end, he didn't just acquire a dealership. He transformed the way everyone there understood the importance of respect and integrity. Edward Grant proved that appearances cannot define a person's worth. He turned a small moment of humiliation into a resounding triumph, earning admiration and respect from those who had once dismissed him. Edward Grant transformed a dealership once rife with arrogance and discrimination into a place where every customer was treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or status. He didn't just change the company culture. He sent a powerful message. Appearances can be deceiving, and you never know who might walk through your door. Under Edward's leadership, the dealership became a symbol of integrity and exceptional customer service, a place where everyone was equally welcomed. His story serves as a profound reminder to never underestimate someone based solely on how they look. A moment of arrogance can lead to an unforgettable lesson, a lesson that Edward delivered with unmistakable clarity. Everyone you meet has their own story, and sometimes, it's the most unassuming individuals who hold the power to change the world. If this story has inspired you, please support the Life Stories channel by hitting the subscribe button so you won't miss any more meaningful stories. Don't forget to like and share to spread this message to even more people. Let's work together to build a community where kindness, respect, and compassion are always valued. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.